and I came in under social media. Then I took over all of corporate marketing. And then I transitioned from the kind of brand side to the performance side. I took over all of the lifecycle marketing for over 500 million people in the world. I got to do one of the first product-led sales teams in the world was at DropBox. These were all incredible opportunities, but I had to kind of go with the flow of the river, which doesn't always go in a straight line. And sometimes the only way you know if an opportunity is good is you just have to listen to your gut. It's like a sixth sense that you have of this feels like it's a fit. Just like when you're interviewing and you feel like something isn't good, you need to listen to your gut and say, this is probably not the right job for me. I've just heard so many executives say that of like, I got all these red flags and I didn't take it because I was kind of blinded by the comp or the title. But you really, even as I'm saying it, I'm thinking about an interview that I'm a part of right now. And I'm like, I think I know I shouldn't take this.
Get ready for the ProducTea with Leah, your fun-sized dose of business, tech, growth, and product chatter. I'm your host, Leah, and it's time to spill the tea. Top of the growth morning with Leah and a very special guest. Roll up, and lend an ear because we've got the human version of a Swiss Army knife on the show today. A left brain, right brain maestro who's been in the trenches of every revenue stage you can imagine. 0 to 10? Done. 10 to 100 million? Done. 100 to $1 billion? Done. She's been in the belly of the beast at DropBox from mere millions to $1 billion IPO. She also steered Crunchbase through a dizzying 10x SaaS ARR growth as their chief growth and marketing officer. To lighten things up, Shanee also worked for some very little-known companies. You might have heard of some of them. Salesforce, NVIDIA, Sony Computer Entertainment. Yep, that's her too. But hold your horses because Shanee is currently scouting for the next big challenge. Series B or later SaaS companies, listen up. You might just be the lucky ones to have her join your ranks. And remember, folks, don't let her hair fool you. It might look blue, but she'll have your company's number in the black in no time. The indomitable Shanee Ben-Zur. How are you doing this morning?
I'm better now after hearing that intro. Thank you.
How would you rate this intro from 0 to IPO?
Ooh, I would say it's just before the IPO when everybody's so excited and they haven't experienced the disappointment of a post-IPO pop.
I really like this. Shanee, can you introduce yourself to the fools that may not know you?
Hi, my name is Shanee Ben-Zur. As Leah said, I have been in the trenches from the small pre-IPO to the post-IPO world. I come from a growth background via the marketing world, and now I'm doing all things product-led growth and helping companies figure out what's the best way to give value to customers so they can get value back for themselves.
I already have a topic that I want to talk to you about, but I'm first of all very glad that you're here. I'm going to talk about everything from the start of the universe to until IPOs continuously. So, but maybe a personal question that I ask everyone. What do people get wrong about you once they do know you?
I think a lot of people see the big hair and the pretty big personality, and they think that I am a true extrovert. And the reality is I'm an outgoing introvert, meaning I can do this. I could go on a podcast. I could speak to a group of 100,000 people. But at the end of the day, when it comes to very, intense one-to-one conversations, I need to take a nap afterwards. And in fact, going remote was great for me because it allowed me between meetings to just be quiet and re-energize. And oftentimes I'll shut off a Zoom and just physically go, and then hype myself back up before the next one. And I think when we were 100% in person, I never had a chance to do that. So at the end of the day, I would get home from work and just physically collapse. So I think people find that surprising before they really get to know me. And then after they get to know me, they know.
This is quite funny because when I was at Small PDF, I was there for 3 years. I think at some point COVID caught up to me and I was really tired, right? And of course, Leah does not take days off. So she just keeps working because she's not that smart. So I was in one of these meetings and I looked really tired. And one of the guys just went like, that's how you look when you're tired. And I feel like sometimes people just get this perception of you, like because of who you are on the talks, right? Yeah. So like on the calls, like all the time. So they think like, okay, I see her all the time like this. They must probably think that I live in this chair. I just don't go out or just don't do anything else. And it is quite funny because it does just that to you. Because when you're in an office, I feel like you're going out, you have lunch together, you see each other when you're standing, that kind of stuff. And yeah, it never really happens then in the end. So yeah, that was, I can totally relate to that.
Yeah, when we've had some in-person events after being in COVID for a while, the first thing that people always say is they comment on whether the person they're talking to is taller or shorter than they thought when they saw them on Zoom.
That is exactly what they say to me as well. Oh my God, you're so tall. You're so tall. I could not imagine you being so tall. I said like, yeah, okay, cool. Thank you.
Heard it.
All right. So did you have a lot of these naps after meetings during the IPO? Were you involved in there? Or was it just like this kind of dream where the entire company goes completely crazy? Then the IPO announcement comes, everybody cannot believe and is trying to calculate how much money that they make. And then it's not that much. And then they figure out the taxes are coming and everything goes into a depression. And then they're kind of sort of okay with it. Was that also how it was for you?
Similar. I mean, pre-IPO, you have to make a choice about whether you're going to sell to cover the taxes before. So the IPO is coming. It's very confidential. They don't tell you exactly when it will happen, but it's coming. So you have to make the decision as a shareholder. All these shares that you've had that are pretty much valueless in the real world pre-IPO, and they're telling you, hey, we're about to IPO. We don't know exactly what the price will be after your lockup period, but you have to decide whether you want to kind of vanish some of these RSUs that you have now for an imaginary amount of taxes, or whether you want to write a check and send it in the mail to somebody you don't know. And, depending on the number of shares you have, this could be on the order of tens of thousands to $100,000 check that you're writing before you got any money. And you're going to have to wait at least 6 months before you get that money back. And it's a very, for a lot of young people, it's the biggest check they've ever written, and again, like, do you even have that money on hand? So it was really exciting. Like, what a privilege to even be asked that question. But it's definitely one of those moments where you're like, you really have to believe in the company that you've been working for. And you really have to believe that the IPO is going to be successful. And in the lead up, I think of the IPO as like your wedding day, right? Everybody is getting ready for the wedding day. Some people, it's a little bit of a surprise wedding for some people at the company. They don't know exactly, but they know that they have to make everything look good. And so every metric is being cleaned up. Everything is being made to look beautiful. And so everybody kind of has, the 6 to 12 months prior to IPO, everything just turns on. You're, the equivalent of the getting ready for your wedding day is like you're getting wax plucked and, shined. And that's what you're doing as a company. So I think in some ways, everybody at the company is involved. And then as you get closer and closer to the announcement, the closer you are to that part of the business, I would say finance, legal, and marketing are probably the people who are closest to the IPO. And it's thrilling. I mean, that there are not that many companies that actually IPO, and being a part of a company that was so, the journey to IPO was crazy. We had, at one point, we were a decacorn. We were worth 10 billion. And then the street marked us down and we lost 5 billion in value. And we thought, oh gosh, are we even going to IPO? So the fact that we were able to IPO was a really thrilling thing. And then, the internal teams that do events, they did an incredible launch day. I mean, you walked into the office and the energy of IPO was there. It was such a wonderful day. Like, they really helped every single employee feel the energy of the IPO, even if you weren't in New York ringing the bell. So it was amazing. Even if you didn't make any money, you felt like you were a part of something really important.
It is quite funny. Like, I have not been part of an actual IPO, at least I think. No, I don't. Leah is a bit old. So we sold companies for millions, not billions, but like for millions at least. And what you just said before is quite funny. So there's two things that usually happen when a company is being sold. First of all, everybody in the company who has some kind of shares, stocks, or whatever, they start to read for the first time since they're in the company, they read their actual ESOP agreement. This is the first thing that they do. And they don't really understand it at all. And they always tell you that through the entire years, like how absolutely important it is that they have the equity. Like, it's super, like every employer is like, yeah, but I want to have more shares. I want to have this and that. But nobody knows exactly how it works. And this is killing me. This is really killing me. Like, people were all constantly coming to me like, hey, Leah, can you explain to me how ESOP works and how this works and how that works? And I'm just like, you did not read this when you signed the contract? Yeah, like we kind of knew what we're going to get and so forth. But like, you can get really fucked by these agreements if they're not set up clearly, right? So like, I'm thinking of Klarna right now. And this is internationally as well, also another nightmare. Every country has different kind of rules, whether it counts as income while you don't have it, what do you do if you leave, right? And then this lockdown period is also very, very funny.
Yeah.
It's quite funny that this is important to everyone and nobody reads their contracts. You could literally write in there that you get a pink pony and it's at 9 o'clock in the morning and nobody would know.
This is kind of like another example of the rich getting richer, right? Because when you're really early in your career, you don't even know that you should hire an employment lawyer. Or if you know that you should hire an employment lawyer, you find out how much they cost per hour and you can't afford to hire an employment lawyer. I think it's a little different now that we have ChatGPT, because you could just copy and paste the whole thing into ChatGPT and ask it whatever questions you want. But, when I was getting my first contract, I definitely didn't have ChatGPT and I definitely couldn't afford a lawyer. And my very first job, I definitely didn't know to even get a lawyer or where to find a lawyer even. So there is a little bit of a predatory nature to, I think I can say this now, when I was first getting, I won't say which company it was. When I was first getting an offer, I was trying to negotiate for my job, which is a normal practice, what my comp should be. And the hiring manager, who was a man, said, well, if this is important to you, maybe this isn't the right job. And it was one of those things where I was being shamed for asking for what I was worth, because I had actually been making more money prior to that job. And then he tried to tell me, like, this is what the equity could be worth. You should be valuing it on the equity. And I think there are so many companies that fail, that the way that startups do the, like, here's how you should think about your equity, and then they show you the $1 billion valuation, is pretty predatory, because you're preying on people who don't have experience with money in that way, and then shaming them for not saying yes right off the bat. So it was a lesson learned. I'm glad I took that job, because ultimately the sum of all my jobs got me here. But I think about that moment often.
Yeah, I think you touched on something very important. Let's maybe conclude this kind of topic after this. But I think if I had to give any tip to anyone who's young or a little bit inexperienced when it's coming to equity, first of all, you might feel like everybody else understands how your equity works in the company, and you don't. That's not true. Actually, nobody understands, not even this, definitely not half the C-level, for sure not, except for the CFO maybe, and the CEO, and whoever is with the board. But I feel like it is important to understand what the purpose is of equity, right? Equity, the purpose that it has is to give the employee the impression that they have skin in the game and that it is worth it to stay beyond if they just look for like the monthly compensation, right? So like the longer you stay, the more you kind of have your skin in the game. And I don't mean this in a facetious, you know what I mean? Like in a bad way. I just mean that the appearance is more important sometimes for some companies than the actual value, because unless you have read the agreement, the ESOP agreement or the stocks and the fandom shares, whatever your structuring is, you do not know what you're going to get. And then also on top of it, also your local laws. So me as an advisor who has clients now all over the world, I need to be very careful, because every ESOP agreement that I'm going to make, because I advise for equity, I need to be very clear on what I'm getting, because if I have to buy this stuff out at some point, it's going to become like quite difficult, right? And I don't want to move into these traps. So I have a lawyer as well on the side, and I just read the stuff. I don't like it, but I have to. Yeah.
Were you ever screwed by a bad agreement?
I would say so, but it was mostly my fault. A typical Leah looks for the fault on her side. And I feel like the entire vesting scheme sounds simple from the outside. So the first time that I dealt with it, right? So like you have a vesting cliff, and then it goes a couple of years, and then your shares are vesting and so forth. It can become quite tricky if there is a promotion in these 3 years, or if there is a buyout in these years, or if you have a promotion and then you leave the company in this particular time frame, what happens to your shares, how much is actually calculated.
Yeah.
And an interesting thing that I actually noticed is that I was held back then to ask how it works, because I feared that if I do ask, that they know that I'm looking for a new job. And that's kind of stupid, right? So like, you should do it when you're not looking for a new job, when you're new in the company. Ask exactly how it works until you understand. And if somebody tells you, hey, why are you asking these questions? You should not ask these questions. Then you should like, yeah, well, I should also not be working here maybe, because this is just not like, you're giving your time for payment. But you know how it is, right? Like, we're always guilt tripped. We're always just like, oh, well, maybe, I mean, you shouldn't ask that many questions, like, don't get confused in your head.
Yeah. Don't worry your pretty little head. Like, my pretty head is always worried.
Amen to that. Yeah, but so let's also go into this direction a little bit. So you had a lot of C positions and executive level positions and so forth. And if you had to kind of go back and reflect on what was different before you had your first one to what you imagine it would be like when you were younger, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't even have to go that far back. But when I was at DropBox, by the time I left, it was a fairly large company. It was a post-IPO company. We had quite a lot of layers of leadership. And the most important skill at DropBox was, do you know how to kind of negotiate between those different teams? So you were spending quite a lot of time selling an idea and less time executing an idea, because it just took so long to get an idea across the finish line, because there were so many different teams that you had to navigate. And without a C-level title, it really was negotiation, because you didn't have the leverage to just say, do it. You had to convince and cajole. And there was like, you were almost haggling at some points of like, I remember we were trying to cut up the customer journey between a different team. And it was like, well, I'll take this one because of this. And don't worry, it's not going to infringe on you. You'll still be able to do your thing. And then when I got to Crunchbase and, I started with the head of, then I got to the C-level, what I realized was people were listening so much to what I was saying that I still thought I was back at DropBox and I was having to convince. But what was happening was they were already yes with me as soon as I said something. And then I would really, I'd be making this big case. And then what they heard was, there can be no dissent. Whereas at DropBox, there was always debate. We were always debating with each other and people felt comfortable disagreeing with me. And then once I got to Crunchbase and I had this leadership role, they felt that they couldn't. And so what ended up happening was, unbeknownst to me, people were just saying yes. I thought I had gotten so good at selling that everyone was saying yes. And I was like, woo, go me. And then what I realized was nobody was saying no. And that was terrible. So I had to learn a whole different skill set, which is in the C-level, learning how to almost shrink yourself so that other people will grow. Because what I want, my ideal state, is that everybody around me feels comfortable sharing an alternative view, so that then we can actually pick and choose the one that's the best. And oftentimes my idea is not the best. But if they're giving me that free like cachet and assuming that mine is the best, then they're going to stop being innovative. So that was a very big 180 for me.
That is so funny, because the first time I was ahead of anything, I was ahead of product that was about 15 years ago. So I had no clue. I had no product chops, nothing, but I was ahead of product.
Nice.
And it is interesting because if you come from one gig and you go to another one, right? The thing that you also leave behind is kind of the trust that you built up with your team, right? So people just kind of know you. They kind of trust you, as you said, like they know who you are, and you have this culture of challenging back and forth. But when you get to a new company already as a head of anything, you have to rebuild the trust again, but you're doing so from a completely different perspective.
Totally.
For you, for one day to the next, nothing has changed. For them, we have a new boss, right? Someone that holds power over me, someone that could actually let me go or something like this. And that was always alien to me, because I never saw myself this way, right? Like, I'm never playing the rank card or whatever. And if I learned one lesson as an executive, or even just already as a team lead, I would say, watch your mouth.
Yes.
Watch your mouth. Whatever you say, someone will remember. And I don't mean like outrageous stuff. Just like, hey, I hate roadmaps. Boom. Next week in the company internal newspaper, we do not do roadmaps anymore. It's over. We're completely getting rid of planning. Did you also have something like this? Because this was, oh my God, I cannot speak anymore. I should be very, very careful.
Yeah. It's the well, Shanee said, and then you hear it through the grapevine and it ends up being like a bad game of telephone. And by the time it gets back to you, you're like, I never said anything like that. And yet now you have like so and so told so and so who's on a different team. And then they told another person. And now that's what they all think that you believe. And that what I learned was I don't want to be a micromanager. So I don't want to be involved in the execution, but I want to spend a lot of time up front with all of the contributing teams to deliver firsthand what my perspective is. And my perspective is a combination of what does success look like? What does failure look like? And what are some initial inputs that I have for you? And then what are some rough ideas that have not been vetted in any way, shape, or form for you to work off of? And once I do that, then I know that I owned that narrative of those critical things. And then they can take it across the finish line versus if you're giving feedback in like little micro spurts along the way, it ends up it's almost like you've tied their shoelaces together. They end up tripping at that stage.
Yeah. We had one of these funny exercises about radical candor, which by the way, I find it very good. I find it a good exercise. I find it really good. So basically what you do is you get together and then you tell someone something that they probably don't hear otherwise. You're like radically honest, but like also compassionate and so forth. So we're getting together for this entire exercise. And then the person who was organizing it says like, okay, and now we put the C-level in the room because nobody wants to hear from a C-level criticism down to the operative level.
Yeah.
And I was like, oh no, being locked again away from the operative people. It's like, I don't know. I feel like you give off you give something up if you start to have a management role. I feel like it's fun. It's okay, right? Like I'm laying my head of role down now and I'm going to go back into advising. But the funny bit is that as an advisor, and I usually advise also over C-levels and so forth, it's the exact same thing happens. The one person that the C-levels are always listening to are the advisors. Because if you pay a lot of money, there must be something for it, right? So like we need to listen to them. So ironically, if I give advice on growth motions, like PLG and all this kind of stuff from the product side and so forth, I kind of also have to kind of teach them on how to bring it into their organization.
Yeah.
So like, don't just like come in with the hammer and just like kill everyone and just say like, this is how it is. Sure, we need to have company buy-in, but like there is a specific way on how to introduce this because if something is not accepted, then if somebody comes in from a different function, telling you from one of the evil voices that they have in their head on how to do their job.
It's so true. And it's kind of like the equivalent in the product world of the value of onboarding and activation. Like it doesn't matter how good your product is. It doesn't matter how good the advice is. If the team doesn't know or understand the value to them or know how to do it or when to do it, then it's going to be bad for you as the advisor. You win when they are like desirous of onboarding your ideas, because then they're going to come back to you again and again and again. And that's like the actual change management is almost the hardest part of everything, no matter what is. It doesn't matter how good your idea is, whether you're internal or an advisor. If people don't believe in it or they don't know how to execute it, it's like a tree falling in a forest when no one's around.
Yeah, and we love trees, don't we? I love trees, for instance. Yeah, I do. I totally do. So like, you just don't want to be not around when they fall.
Yes, I moved to the Pacific Northwest from California to be around a lot of trees. I had friends who were here this weekend and I was like, let's go outside and hug the trees in the backyard. It feels better than you think.
Yeah, no, it does. So interestingly, like, but you as a person as well, like, and you also had your background, most of your background is also now in tech, of course, and maybe also as a woman that maybe didn't have it that easy as well in your career. Like, when you came up in the tech world, in that sense, because we always had to climb some kind of ladder, how did your ladder look like? And what were the steps that gave you, I don't know, maybe some more difficulty than others? That's a broad question, isn't it?
But it opens up a lot of things. Sometimes, they say don't look down when you've climbed up really high. Don't look down because it's scary and you think you might fall. And I think that's very true. The climb up was perilous, and there were some times that were more scary than others. And now that I got to where I wanted to be, I only look down if I'm trying to help somebody else up. And I'm a very big fan of helping other people up because of the amount of times that I would have benefited had somebody tried to help me up. When I faced sexism, I faced definitely some things that had I been working in a post Me Too movement would have ended differently than they did at that time. I started in a pre-Me Too world, and I had male figures who were trying to guide my career in ways that weren't actually true to what I wanted. I had male coworkers who got the promos over me. I was the only woman in the room many times. I was just in an interview the other day where, it's me and all the other C-level executives, and I'm the only woman. And it was not a great experience all the time, but I was extremely lucky for several reasons. One was I had some wonderful male bosses who were supportive of me. And then later in my career, I had some wonderful women identifying bosses, and they were very supportive. And they also represented a lot of kind of like the role model part to see what different types of women's personalities could be successful. And I got here. It was not an easy path. I would say my career, you were talking about me as like the Swiss Army knife. And I think the reason why I've been able to see so many different things is I'm open to where the river is flowing in terms of my career. And I see a lot of folks now, I do a lot of mentoring, who want that very linear path. Like, I have this job title, I want that job title, and then I want to get here. And if you can get that linear thing, good for you. The shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. But my personal experience has been work as hard as I possibly can, and then see where there is an opening, and then take that opening, even if that opening is a little unusual. Like, I was working at NVIDIA. I'd been there for 3 years. I was busting my butt, and I had all these great experiences, but I felt like I was getting pigeonholed into just doing social media. And I started looking around, and Salesforce had a job, but it was doing digital marketing for their employer brand. It wasn't on the product side, it was on the employer brand side. And I did not come from the HR world. I didn't really come from the recruiting world. But as I spoke to the team there, they got really excited about my knowledge of online marketing, my knowledge of website optimization, content marketing. It was all the things I wanted to do more of that I wasn't getting the opportunity to do at NVIDIA. And they were excited for me. And I took that job, and it was a really kind of a detour. It wasn't a straight line in the world that I wanted to. I wanted to stay near product. But it was a wonderful experience because in that job, there weren't any other people who were doing digital marketing the way that I do it. And so I got the freedom to experiment and try things. And I worked with a global team. I was building digital marketing around the world for Salesforce. And it helped me because then I got to work at Salesforce, which is an incredible company, and the stock was doing great. And I got to travel around. It was wonderful. And then I went back to doing social media at DropBox. And the reason why I took that job was I had to take a pay cut. It felt like I took a scope cut, but I bet on DropBox. And that worked out for me because at DropBox, I was there for almost 5 years. I was there pre and post IPO. I got to try a lot of different jobs. When you're in a high growth company, your roles change. And I came in under social media. Then I took over all of corporate marketing. And then I transitioned from the kind of brand side to the performance side. I took over all of the lifecycle marketing for over 500 million people in the world. I got to do one of the first product-led sales teams in the world was at DropBox. These were all incredible opportunities, but I had to kind of go with the flow of the river, which doesn't always go in a straight line. And sometimes the only way you know if an opportunity is good is you just have to listen to your gut. It's like a sixth sense that you have of this feels like it's a fit. Just like when you're interviewing and you feel like something isn't good, you need to listen to your gut and say, this is probably not the right job for me. I've just heard so many executives say that of like, I got all these red flags and I didn't take it because I was kind of blinded by the comp or the title. But you really, even as I'm saying it, I'm thinking about an interview that I'm a part of right now. And I'm like, I think I know I shouldn't take this.
I know exactly what you mean. And this also extends to when you're hiring as an executive for other people, right? Like when something does not feel right, you just don't go for it, even if it takes you a longer time to hire someone.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you said a lot of good things here. And I want to touch on two things here. So I would say, two managers that were incredibly inspiring for me, like as role models. And I feel like people underestimate what it means sometimes for someone to not have a role model that you can identify with, because then it's kind of like almost, oh, I don't see a path for myself there. And for me, this was exactly the same. So these two people, one of them was Stephanie. She was an incredible, incredible manager. She was my CEO at the time. And she said, do good things, Leah, and talk about them. And I could not really put this into perspective, what she means with that. And a couple of years later, I heard one of my other bosses it was ironically at Small PDF, Mike said, you're wasting your potential. You're wasting your potential. Like it's like one is a very, very positive kind of phrase, and the other one is just like, you're wasting your potential. What are you doing here? And it was not just about like, hey, what are you doing here in the company? It was just like, hey, why don't you just start to trust yourself and talk about it, right? And it took me so long to just really distill over the years and years and years and years, just to like kind of figure out, hey, it is totally okay to not know what the solution is before you start working, as long as you trust yourself that you have the skills, that you will find them. In other words, I suffered from a heavy imposter syndrome. I always thought that I'm not good enough because I looked at all these role models that were not around. So I had no path to go. And I just thought, frankly, that managers are idiots. I looked at how they were leading their teams, how they were leading their companies. And it just like, there were so few good ones. They made me maybe feel good, right? But like maybe the other people not, that I was just like, hey, what is this, right? So like, where's the secret school that these people go to school for,
Yeah.
right? So like, what kind of books are they reading?
Yeah.
Like, what are they kind of doing when they're just like running around in their business suits and then they close the door to their office, because that was the experience that we had. Yeah. Again, you have to just trust yourself. And it's interesting because I'm 42 now and I don't feel different in some way. Like I don't feel like I'm 42. It's just like, you just are, and the age does not give you wisdom. It's kind of like you have to work yourself through it. And it doesn't get better sometimes if you don't really put it in.
Yeah.
The work.
There are definitely a lot of people who have asked me like, what book do you recommend? What course do you recommend? And there wasn't really a book or a course that I took. It was a lot of trial and error. It was a lot of, frankly, the messing up was where I learned the most. And I think for me, I approach things with you were talking about like, find what Leah did wrong. I also approach things with the find what Shanee did wrong. And I actually think that's a superpower. There are some people who are so defensive that they can't be open to what they did wrong, which means they actually can't grow. Whereas if you are vulnerable, if you are open to looking for what your improvement or growth opportunity is, like the sky is the limit. You're constantly going to be on a journey of optimizing. And I think it's wonderful. The dangerous part is when you only do that and you don't give yourself credit for the wins. And I've managed a lot of people like that, where they walk into a room and they assume everybody else knows more than them. And so they hold back their thoughts and they let people who know much less than them speak. And then in their mind, they're like, that doesn't sound right, but that person must be smarter than me. So maybe I'm wrong for thinking that it's wrong. And so I've had to help those folks kind of objectively look at like, what is your track record? What have you done to get here? Do you think that means you know about what you're doing? Yes. Okay. So now when you get into the room, you at least know as much as these other people. And if you don't share your perspective, you're actually robbing them from that opportunity to hear where you're coming from. So you're doing them a disservice. And if you are wrong, what's the worst that can happen? Somebody says, that's not right. And then you go, okay, and you move on. But if you are right, what's the worst that can happen if you say nothing? Well, that means the company could take the wrong direction. So that's a much worse risk than just being wrong in the room.
Yeah, and you're not gaining anything from being the person with all the ideas all the time, right? Like that's the other thing. I feel like my method of working was always in the teams that I had that if you can establish a culture where people are open about the things that they don't know, even though they would belong to their job description, right? So, like, I'll give you a good example. So, for myself, I was skating by for way too long on SQL knowledge, like for, like doing basic data analysis as a product manager. And I never really did it back then. And I always kind of like skated the issue and so forth. And yeah, what an idiot I was. Because if I would have, then maybe, someone would have told me then, hey, Leah, you're otherwise a really good product manager, but in this particular thing, you just suck. So here's how you can learn it. So what did I have to do? Because I did not admit to it, I kind of had to search for ways around it and so forth until I finally learned it, right? So like, this is the thing where people just like, you don't have to know everything, specifically not if you're doing a job like, oh, I'm in product or I'm in marketing or I'm in sales or I'm in growth. Oh my Lord, there is no one who knows everything about these roles. And it has come to, for me, as one of the biggest life hacks in that sense is that whenever I go with advising or if I go into a new job, I'm extremely upfront about the things where I feel like I'm
Yeah.
the weakest in.
Yeah.
And I'm just telling them, like, hey, just so you know, I'm not that good in this part. Is that okay for you? And then sometimes you hear back, hey, thanks a lot for telling us. We actually think that's kind of a feature, or we just do not know it. We just do not need that, or we don't need the domain experience and so forth. So this becomes suddenly like powerful because now you're like, I don't have to hide. And there is strength in this vulnerability for sure.
I agree. The one thing I will say is that women tend to talk about what they can't do more than men can. And men often look at their small amount of knowledge of a specific topic and then they feel confident saying that they know it well enough. Like all the research about when you look at a job description, typically you'll see a woman look at it and they say, oh, I only have 60% of this. And then they don't apply. Whereas a male will look at it and say, oh, I've got 60% of this. I can do this. Like, submit the application. So I think you're right. You should be honest about what you can and can't do, but don't let that, like, the fact is you still entered into that conversation with them. You didn't like let somebody else disqualify you. Don't disqualify yourself.
Yeah, no, for sure. That was not, Leah does not make any mistakes anymore. Now I'm perfect. I told you that before.
I support that.
So that doesn't happen. Yeah, that doesn't happen anymore. But yeah, no, it can help. It can help to be vulnerable. What was interesting for me though is that I think since I've also been talking more openly about imposter syndrome, an interesting thing has actually happened. And I think you would assume that more women have imposter syndrome. I think we're just more outspoken about it.
Yeah.
I think a lot of guys are suffering from this as well, all the way to the top, right? So like I'm talking C-levels, like really, really big companies. They're just like, hey, I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. Like yesterday I woke up, like if you have a bad day, you need to speak in front of 10,000 people. You're not going to go like, hey, you know what, guys, maybe can we move this meeting for tomorrow? No, you just need to perform all the time because there's just like so much depending on you all the time. You kind of have to be constantly on. And I feel like, yeah, this should not sound like, oh, boo-hoo, the executive is crying. But I'm just saying, like, there are facets to this job that you have to kind of experience before you can really empathize with them. And I feel like we all are going through it.
Yeah.
Maybe.
I wish more men would say it because I think that would make the whole company feel better versus leaning more into the, like, everything's fine, I'm fine, walk it off. I think if everybody was a little more honest about when they were doing well versus when they were struggling, it would make everybody feel better. And that was definitely something I learned later on. Like when I first got into leadership roles, I thought I must be perfect. I must be infallible. I must show that I never am weak. And what that did was it just created fear within my organization that they couldn't be making any mistakes. No. And then what I saw that translate to was they would overhype their metrics. They would try to make their work look better because they were afraid of looking like they weren't successful, where what I really want is a culture of more of that, like, transparency, humility, and saying, okay, things are not going well. I really need help. What do we do? And so I had to change the way I showed up to not be, helpless or anything, but just be honest of like, hey, today I just want to let you know I've got a lot on my mind. So if you feel like I'm distracted, it's because I am. It's not because of you. And that just changed everything. And then people were able to communicate in the same way back to me. And I was like, okay, great. And they could also talk about their numbers in the same way. So there's like power in that vulnerability in terms of being honest about all things.
Yeah. How many growth teams did you have at Crunchbase or like just in general?
Well, at Dropbox, the organization was set up that there was a dedicated full stack growth organization, and that was separate from marketing. They had product managers, engineers, analysts, and they were doing everything. And then we worked really closely with them from the kind of lifecycle perspective, where we would almost do everything up until the point of conversion, and then they would own the point of conversion. At Crunchbase, there was not a dedicated growth team. I was sort of building this dotted line matrix organization, however you want to talk about it, where we would kind of carve out some resources from product and engineering and analytics. And then we would help identify what are the biggest opportunity points in the customer journey, like what are the conversion rates we want to optimize. And then we would come up with a shared roadmap. I would say there's pros and cons in each flavor of the dedicated growth team versus the matrix. But that was at Crunchbase, it was definitely much more of that influence without authority.
The reason why I'm asking is because you usually, so I'm not saying that this is what happened at Crunchbase or Dropbox or whatever, but like if you bring growth into a company function in some way, what also happens for the first time through the culture of growth teams is that things are becoming measurable.
Yes.
And I want to touch on this, what you just said before. This is why I ask now this question. As you start to become measurable in terms of your performance and the goals that you are set out, so like if you, let's say you have an ideal growth team, they have a hypothesis, every quarter they're coming and they say like, are we going to achieve this and that?
Yeah.
You will also see points of failure.
Yeah.
And actually it's more common to have these failures, right? So like suddenly when you're now getting this measurement, then you might think that you have more visibility into the organization, and you kind of do. But a very common mistake that I see being done is that these points of failures that are now objective are being used to punish people, right? So like it's like, hey, why did this not go good? So while in theory everybody agrees to what you said, yeah, we should have an honest culture, yeah, we should be open to experiment, yeah, we should admit to our weaknesses. The one moment where you as an exec start to flip out because of a bad result, you're going to destroy 6 to 12 months of culture building if you want to put it into a number. 100%.
I agree wholeheartedly. And that was when I first got to Crunchbase, I was simultaneously building this matrix growth organization and building a marketing organization. And I bring my growth mentality to marketing, whereas like traditional marketing organizations, they're measured on the number of initiatives or the size of the initiatives. I don't care about either of those. I care about impact to business metrics. And so the culture that I was building there was we are learning. We are a team that is constantly learning. And what we're doing is asking questions of, if I do this, then does this thing that I think will happen actually happen? And I brought the culture of experiments and hypotheses to marketing. And I told them the number one thing that matters is impact. It almost doesn't matter. The means to the end doesn't matter as long as we're ethical and legal. But what matters is, can you actually help drive the value for the customer and the value for the company? And I was surprised by how hard it is to break people from the not measurement oriented mentality. And I did see it also in the product organization, where they were used to celebrating the fact that a feature was launched, because it's so hard to even build and get a feature launched, that once I was starting to say like, well, within the growth world, it's not about whether you launch the experiment. It's about whether the experiment validated or invalidated the hypothesis. And then how quickly can you move after you get that answer? If it validated it, how quickly can you scale? If it invalidated it, how quickly can you launch the subsequent experiment? And it is kind of shocking once you live in this growth world and you see the value of operating this way. It's kind of shocking to see how much it is not a part of basic culture.
Yeah, this is very true. And I think it's quite interesting because I remember a conversation that I had about 6 to 7 months ago with someone from my organization, where they just asked that. So what do you think about empowered engineers and empowered so-and-so, right? So like empowered, insert any function. And I was always like, so what do you think this means? And they were like, yeah, like I've been reading some blogs and I've been reading some things, like I feel like that the decisions need to come from the operative layer. And I'm like, yeah, I agree. I absolutely agree. But like, how does this play out, And this is usually where things are becoming quite dicey, as in like, so how do you build this, right? So like, what do you need for this?
Yeah.
no one that talks about this, or at least that was talking about it back then, was talking about like, okay, okay, you can make your decisions as long as they move the metrics as we define them that make sense, which we also need to sit together and kind of define first. But it's not going to be revenue. Not always, right? So like not every team is moving revenue.
Yeah.
Maybe some teams are just moving customer success signals that are not hanging on the revenue, or like the churn numbers or whatever. And this is like a mind-blowing kind of concept for most people. And I feel like I've made this mistake many times in the past. The amount of times that you have to talk about these basics is probably 80% of your job, over and over and over and over again. Because over the time of a normal tenure, so like let's say 2 years with a team of about 100 people, I have statistically about 10 to 20 of those that are either switching, either jobs internally, or some of them are going. So you now have new people who have never heard this message.
Mhm.
So you cannot just come in and say like, oh, I'm building my tenure like a course. First, I'm going to show them how outcome-driven goals work. Then I bring in the culture, and then everything works. That's just not how it works. You're constantly at the start, and you will talk about it until your mouth hurts.
I agree. And you almost have to give yourself permission to keep repeating, because you're like, this must be old news to people. But you find every time that they're like, oh, that's such a good point. You're like, I literally said this to you 2 weeks ago. But once you give yourself permission to be a broken record, everybody really appreciates it, because at the end of the day, every employee just wants to do a good job. And they want you to tell them what a good job is. And they don't want to be surprised, and they don't want you to test them. They just want to know, give them some certainty in an uncertain world. And so if you can keep repeating that same thing over and over again to where they're like, okay, I know this is what good looks like, then they can make it happen on their own. And, I think that ended up happening for us, especially at Crunchbase, is like, then I saw the product teams were asking those questions. They were saying, this hypothesis was disproven, and they were working on roadmaps that were moving quickly, much better than if I had been involved in every step of the way. Like, they were able to take the ball and run with it. And it was wonderful. Like, once I saw the point of the conversation change to impact versus execution, I was like, that's great. My work here is done. And that was part of the reason why I felt comfortable leaving too, is like, you know what?
Yeah.
It is in the culture now. It is part of it.
I love this so much. And there's this one thing that I feel like that was very, very difficult for me. In order to give people compliments for the work that they've done, so basically the way that you just said it now means that you have to believe that your judgment is worth something in the eyes of others. And that was very difficult for me at the start, to just kind of say like, hey, I'm proud of you, what you did, right? And then their eyes light up, and you're just like, oh my God, it's like, I love when you say that, right? Because like compliments are hard to come by from Leah and so forth. And I'm just like, okay, you just heard what I said, but this was so difficult for me to say something like this sometimes, just because who am I to tell you, just because I have the title does not make me better in any way, right? Like I never thought of myself being better just because I have a better title or whatever. And it's a funny little interaction to people. And I would say that if I have one advice there in this regard, then compliment people more than you think, right? Compliment them more. Like you can give feedback. And I don't believe in the shit sandwich stuff, like where you say like, oh, like 2 good things and then a bad thing in the middle. No, fuck it. Just be honest. Always honest.
Yeah.
I don't want people to worry what Leah thinks, because Leah is always speaking her mind. That's just what it is.
I can say as a fellow straightforward talker that people are always worried about what we think. And I think one of the biggest mistakes when I came in and had that more senior role was I underestimated how impactful my compliments were, and I underestimated how impactful my critiques were. And I grew up where like it is hard to come by a compliment, and what authority figures give you is they point out all of your flaws. And that's what love meant, is if I care enough to tell you all the ways you're not good, then that means I really love you. And unfortunately, I initially translated that into my management style. And what was happening was people were just burning out. They were just feeling like so run down. And, I have a lifetime of knowing how to deal with that. But for most of these folks, they didn't grow up that same way. And thank goodness I did this whole like 360 where I brought in a coach. I had her ask the team, like, what am I doing wrong? Because I know I'm doing something wrong. And this kind of came out. And fortunately, they were honest about it. And they were essentially, what they said was they didn't have the psychological safety to receive the critique. They needed to know that I actually do believe in them enough that I believe that they can fix these things that need to be addressed. And so I had to change and do exactly what you just said, which is I had to pump them up. I had to help them see that like the reason they were hired is because they are great. And all that I'm pointing out are the things that will take them from great to fantastic. And once we got there, it completely changed the dynamics of the teams. It was like they would seek that feedback. They wanted to hear that feedback. They would almost say like, well, tell me what I could have done better, even in times when there wasn't anything they could have done better. And I realized it was my fault. I really had to work on building them up. And it's kind of like a precursor to the shit sandwich. It was like, I had to let them know that like the buns were good. I had to bake those buns really nicely first. And then I could give them the critique. And I realized that actually, even though I grew up with just only critique, I really, really love getting complimented. Like when my bosses tell me I did a good job, I feel amazing. It gives me energy. And so that I had to kind of take my own medicine on that one.
I think I'm just going to say one thing to this. For me, it was not really the compliments. It took quite a long time for me to figure out what I like about criticism or compliments. It doesn't matter. And for me, it is relatively simple. If you prove to me in what you say that you listened to what I said, then we're on good terms. That's kind of like the thing, right? Like it doesn't matter whether it's positive or negative. I actually enjoy both. But like if I'm getting the impression that someone has really listened to what I said, like they spent time and they gave me their attention gracefully and put it into words and gave me back how it sounded like, that makes my day. That is something that I really, really enjoy. And I feel like, yeah, I don't know. Feedback is a great thing. People have told me that they cannot deal with my insatiable hunger for feedback. I've heard that too, so take it for what you will. But yeah, we're getting close to the end already. It's been a very short hour almost. Mm-hmm. So let me just ask you one more question. Maybe this is a complete different take on this. Are there any trends in the industry or also us as humans, wherever you want to go, that you are betting on that you think are going to come to reality in the next couple of years?
Yeah. I think what's happening right now is they made sharp 180s as the economy slowed. Any sharp 180 is not good, in my personal opinion. I think that we should make adjustments for the long term versus kind of these last ditch efforts for the short term. And we saw that happen during the pandemic. That was how we ended up in the growth at all costs. Everybody made a super hard right towards growth. Everybody started doing these crazy multiples and fundraising. And then now they're trying to make another super hard right. And it's away from product-led growth, all back into enterprise. And I think that's wrong too. So my bet is moderation. Have a little bit on your long term, have a little bit on growth, spend wisely. And even if the economy accelerates, don't try to catch that wave, because many of those companies, unless your timing is miraculous, they will also get hit by another tsunami coming at them. So my prediction is the companies that are the most successful are the ones that know how to operate with longevity in mind versus the ones that are just trying to kind of grasp at straws. And I think, yes, I am very biased, but I do still believe that if you can figure out how to do some version of product-led growth and product-led sales, that is another key to longevity because it is a cost-efficient means of doing things. And even with product-led growth, the fact that I said it's both PLG and PLS is because I don't think it's one or the other. I think it's the combination of the two. And at the center of all of this is you have to have more customer-centric businesses, because at the end of the day, all the buying power is within that person's hands. So if you're not doing something that's good for them, if you're trying to screw them in some way, that will come back and bite you in the ass. Whether that's, like a company that gets hit by GDPR or a company that gets hit by churn, it is not a long-term solution. And I think what I hope to see is that more companies take on that long-term view of the horizon versus short-term gains.
100%. And as I usually say also in my cohorts, the goal of product-led sales and product-led growth is to find long-term buyers, right? And so I feel like that this is going to be in any commoditized market where customers have choice. It will be the future, and I'm also betting on it. So I'm very happy to have you on this journey as well. So, Shanee, How should people get in contact with you? Do you want them to get in contact with you? And if so, how and what do you want to talk about?
Definitely. I want people to get in contact with me, whether you are looking for advisory support on your revenue strategy, your fundraising strategy, or whether you're looking for a full-time chief growth officer, chief revenue officer, or COO. You can reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm linkedin.com/in/S Ben-Zur, and I am there and available to chat.
It will be in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I hope you had fun too. Thank you so much for listening to the ProducTea with Lea. If you don't have enough yet, you can subscribe to my podcast right now on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or you can head to my website, leatarin.com, which is leahtharin.com, where you can find much more of my material or just want to work with me.